Greetings, my name is Father Steve Macias. I'm the rector of St. Paul's Anglican Church in Los Altos, and this is part 3 of our series on Captains and Courts, which is a pamphlet, unpublished, written by Bishop Sutton, which is a biblical defense of episcopacy. If you missed lesson 1 and 2, this won't make very much sense, so go back and watch those first two. The third chapter and this entire book are available on my website. If you go to stevemacias.com, that's Macias, M-A-C-I-A-S.com, there's a section there called Captains and Courts. Well, I'll post these videos, and you have a link to the PDF to download the pamphlet. Today's topic or chapter is on the New Testament priesthood and how the New Testament priesthood established by the life of Jesus matches the covenantal pattern of the Old Testament and provides the model for an episcopal government in the church today. So first we get back to Exodus 18 with Jethro, and Bishop Sutton makes the argument that Sutton's model of captains and courts over 50 and 100 is re-invoked by Jesus at the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. So briefly, you know the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus calls for the feeding of the multitudes that are following him out in the wilderness, and he comes up with bread and fish, and he multiplies it, and there's enough to feed 5,000 and to fill 12 baskets after that. And Sutton points out that there are certain common grounds here. The story describes the 12 disciples being the people in charge of distributing the bread, which is an interesting parallel if you consider the 12 tribes of Israel being the means by which God's blessing to Abraham goes to the world. Here Jesus is saying, I'm going to feed the 12 disciples and therefore feed the world. There's also another common comparison here between the manna in the wilderness and feeding the folks in Exodus. But having that are important because you go from Christ, who gives it to the 12 disciples, who gives it to the 5,000, and then what's left is able to fill 12 baskets. So again, that number 12 shows up to kind of show this picture. Now it's important that Jesus uses two things. He uses bread and he uses fish. Those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament Psalms or the story of Job know that fish is often a symbol of the Gentiles. You know, the seas roar, the Near East religions that worship the fish god, Jonah swallowed by the great fish. The fish is often a symbol of those outside of the 12 tribes. And so here Jesus is also saying the 12 disciples shall have authority, and he uses the symbol of bread, the manna, the bread from heaven, and he uses that alongside the picture of fish. So bread and fish is Jew and Gentile. What's significant here and what really makes the typology work is that Jesus instructs the disciples to put the people in groups of 50s and 100s. And this is the exact same grouping that you see with Jethro and Moses in the book of Exodus. In Exodus 18, he says, group the people into hundreds and 50s and you shall rule over them type of thing. And so he gives that same type of captains and court structures to his 12 disciples. So you see this very strong parallel. 12, 50, 100. Jesus is invoking common numerical patterns to show what he's doing. Now, on top of that, he's also giving them a sense of pastoral oversight. Later on, when Jesus is approached by people, there's a middleman, it seems, between Jesus and the common people. And we see this most distinctly in the picture of Jesus and the small children. Right? We all know the verse of bring the children unto me, but we often don't think about why wouldn't they bring the children directly to Jesus. And it's because a few chapters earlier, specifically at this account, Jesus kind of puts a hierarchy between he himself and the regular people, and so much that somehow the people got the idea that the children should be way over here and Jesus over here, and that they would need to go through the captains and courts or the disciples and the groupings before they could get directly to Jesus. But Jesus makes the point, let the children come to me, for such is the kingdom of God. He's saying that the point of his disciples or of his hierarchy is to increase access to him, not to decrease, not to mitigate the access. You can see this if you look at the hierarchy for the other direction, especially in the New Testament church. The hierarchy, whether it was elders and deacons, was used to distribute the bread. You remember the story of the elders there first appointed in the church in Acts were complaining, how can we go and preach the gospel if we're waiting on tables? And the solution to increase access to the story and the mercy of Jesus was to establish a hierarchy. And so the people understood there was a hierarchy, and the point of the hierarchy was to increase access to Jesus. And this, of course, has some sacramental implications. In the story there with the folks receiving the bread and the fish, imagine, if you will, for a second, if Jesus himself had to be the one carrying the basket to each and every person, feeding the 5,000. Would that increase or limit the amount of access that they had to Jesus? Of course, it would greatly limit it. So by Jesus establishing his disciples and them establishing groups of 50s and 100s, more people get to experience the miracle of Jesus at a way that they wouldn't have experienced before. The same thing is true of the church today. Because Christ has put his representatives through his church, through his bishops, through his elders, through his deacons in the world, he has actually increased the direct access that people have to Jesus. Another way to say this, and Bishop Sutton does this inside here, is he goes to John chapter 6, towards the middle there in chapter 30, and he talks about how John, or St. John himself, describes this. And Jesus is quoted here, but I'll just read it here from John 6 and 30. It says, "Therefore they said to him, 'What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? Our fathers ate manna in the wilderness. Our fathers ate manna in the desert,' it says. 'As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat.' Then Jesus said to them, 'Most assuredly, I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world.'" Now this is a very important part, because what Jesus is doing at the establishing of the New Testament hierarchy with the 12 and the 50 and the hundreds is he is showing and picturing how Jesus will come to throughout the world. It's through a delegation of his representatives. Because Jesus at the ascension sits at the right hand of the Father, and then now sends forth his church to bring about the bread from heaven. And so we see that each and every Sunday through the celebration of the Eucharist, and we see that through the life of the world developed underneath the church. So again, the point here is to show that there is a parallel between Jethro's ministry and its structure, even down to the very numbers, and Jesus' ministry and the structure, that it exists during the life of Jesus and that is expanded after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, that so many more might come into the church because of the delegation of hierarchy, that more would have access to Christ directly because Christ delegates to his bishops, priests, and deacons on earth. Commend to you to read chapter 3, and if you have any questions, you can leave them here on the YouTube channel. Thank you.